South African power utility Eskom requested tariff increases of 16% per year for the next 5 years. The decision has prompted a lot of debate on how developing economies should price electricity with economic growth in mind. Joining us now to discuss electricity pricing for developing economies are Tembani Bukula. He is a full-time regulator member responsible for electricity at the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, and Anita Matthews. She's Director of Africa Electricity 2012. Tembani, let me begin with you. Should we be blaming you for the 16% increase?
Not yet. This is an application that Eskom has made. We are still going to go through our processes of evaluating the application to determine whether 16% is appropriate in view of all of the other factors that you have mentioned.
Yeah, with 16%, of course, is a big shock number. I mean, the discussion all around the week, of course, has been around the quantum of the increase, particularly given the fact that we do know that Eskom initially wanted 19%. So when you consider the application, you and your colleagues, when you sit down, and I'm sure we are going to blame you anyway, whichever outcome will come out. When you consider the factors that Eskom is looking at, do you also consider the fact that consumers have been laboring under these huge increases for the last, how many now, 3 years now?
Yes, we consider that our function, and one of the things that we have to do is to do this task that's close to being impossible of balancing or having a fair balance between the interests and requirements of all stakeholders. But the other objective that we have is to ensure that the electricity supply industry is sustainable both in the short and the long term, and it's efficient. But to do that, it will not be sustainable if the services are not affordable and people are not paying for them. So it's a very delicate balance that we have to ensure that it's a sustainable system, but the services or the product is still affordable. Yeah,
but at the same time, of course, you have to consider the financial viability of Eskom itself and its ability to be able to raise money both here in South Africa as well as, of course, abroad. Which brings me to the question, so how do you make it possible for a parastatal to price its product in such a way that people think it's fair, but at the same time understand when that same parastatal declares a huge dividend to government and makes a huge profit on the revenue that's coming in?
In this particular instance, though, we have a pact that Eskom has with the government that for the period of the build program, they will not be declaring dividends to the government. But in a case like the one you've mentioned, yes, it becomes an issue. The government is the only shareholder, so there's another part of the Eskom operation that goes to the government as a shareholder in the form of your returns on your equity and returns on your assets. That part, there's a requirement that Eskom must reinvest it into the system, so it does not go to National Treasury and become part of of the fund that National Treasury has. So in this in particular instance, we are immune from that, but in other cases where you have to have that, yes, it is an issue.
It goes into a big pot and disappears into other things, but we'll come back to that conversation. Let me bring you, Anita, here. Is there such a thing as pricing power for a developing economy?
Absolutely.
It is?
In terms of pricing power, that's again from the regulator or the utilities that have more of a say in it. Now, from the way we're looking at in terms of the pricing, it's supply versus demand. In terms of the demand that has in the developing economy, the utilities of the governments, the regulators, how do they supply to that particular industry is what determines to a certain extent, I would say. Now, as an event organizer, what we do is provide a platform to have a discussion and a debate on what are the questions that the end user, a common man, can faces in terms of price tariffs.
I am representing the common man.
Absolutely, so am I. So that's where, interestingly, at the Africa Electricity, which started yesterday, we had a series of discussions and debate sessions covering various areas, and one of which this afternoon that we talked about, is there a right price path for the South Africa economy? And it was quite interesting discussions and presentations presented by our panelists and attendees at this show.
Yeah. Tembani, is it possible to look at Eskom and say, perhaps Eskom, instead of increasing prices by 16%, what they should look at is perhaps looking at what they would make out of, I suppose it's all projections and those kind of things, but look at what they would make on a net basis in terms of profit, and then reduce perhaps by whatever margin that is, so it enables them to cover their costs while at the same time remaining sound financially and their balance sheet looking the way it should for, of course, the rating agencies and all these other born people who put money into it to be comfortable that this is a going enterprise and it is financially sound.
The end game is exactly what you are describing. We are looking at the end of this period, and the period that I'm referring to, this is the period where we are building a lot of infrastructure because we didn't build. So that's why there's a compression of the price increases, compression of the requirements for funding. But once these two power plants have been built and we are now looking at the rest of the power system, then that is possible. You will then have these times and terms that would enable you not to have increases that are above inflation. So the end game is to have exactly that.
What I'm thinking of is a way in which we can make sure that the money doesn't leave the consumer. In other words, the money doesn't leave the consumer, goes to Eskom. Eskom then uses the money to generate electricity, make a profit, give it to government, and then government uses the money as it so wishes. And I'm not in any way suggesting that government would use the money inappropriately. I'm just saying, is there a way in which we can look at these tariff increases and make sure that the increase is at such a level that it is the minimum possible, particularly given the circumstances that South African consumers are in now?
That's part of our function. We have to ensure that Eskom does not get revenues and profits that are higher than what they should get. They should get just what they need. So that's our function. But the other part that you mentioned of retaining the earnings, all of the earnings that are going to be made during this process are going to be retained within Eskom. Not a single cent is going to be taken over by government, other than the tax that any company pays and other levies that go to National Treasury. But the rest of the money will stay within Eskom and will be reinvested into the
I will not talk about the Eskom bonuses and parties and those other kind of things. I'll leave those alone. But I want to talk about the alternatives that the South African consumer has in respect to this Eskom increase. Years ago, we were told that independent power producers might well be the answer that Eskom is looking at in respect of trying to keep prices down and also ensuring that Eskom is an efficient producer and provider of electricity while, of course, standing up to competition. But at the same time now, we are seeing that Eskom is actually saying our increase is 13%. The other 3 percentage point increase is actually going to, in part, it sounded to me like it would be a subsidy to the independent power producers. And yet we were told independent power producers could well be producing power below Eskom's tariffs.
That may well be the case, but the independent power producers that Eskom is referring to right now are the ones for renewable energies. Now, the power from renewable energies is not lower than the power that is generated, the average power that's generated by Eskom. So that would not be true in this case. But the additional 3% is that the reason why people have been wanting independent power producers to come in is because they will not need, whilst they are building the power plants, money from the consumers to do that. They would use their own money. But when they start injecting power into the system, then they would want their money. And these are the monies that are the additional 3%. That's because Eskom is applying for this one. Eskom has been designated as a buyer of this electricity. So when they buy this electricity, they must be able to pay the power producers.
Anita, are you happy with this answer?
In fact, there is a certain interesting twist to this. Even if you're looking at independent power producers, the capital investment, right now when a utility directly invests and takes care of the capital investment, the reflection of the price tariff is quite transparent and quite evident. When it comes to an independent IPP wanting to set up the power plant, the initial investment, the capital investment comes from the IPP, but when they start selling the power to Eskom and thereby to the end users, that's when the price reflection will come. Now, can they afford to sell at a price much lower than what Eskom is providing at this point of time is the big question that we'll have to ask. And that maybe Tembani might be in a better position to answer that than I could.
Tembani is coming back to you.
On renewable energies, the average price of power, of electricity coming from a wind generator is around 125 cents. The average price,
that's where Eskom wants to be.
The average price of electricity generated by Eskom now, the wholesale price is 61 cents. So those are the numbers we're talking about. When you look at photovoltaic, the average price is 2 rand 32 cents. Eskom is 60 cents. We can talk about the other externalities and the other issues, but if we are talking what the consumer pays, that's the amount.
But in the 5 years, Eskom is going to end it around the 120 cents per cubic.
Yes, but remember that even that price is not stagnant. It increases by inflation. So 125 will not be still 125 in 5 years.
There's no escaping this. Power prices are going to go up and we'll have to fork up anyway.
In a way, but I think that there is a way of escaping it. I mean, if you use your electricity efficiently, you just use what you need, you can still continue to pay pretty much the same amount of money that you are paying.
Absolutely. That message is not reassuring, but that's Tembani Bukula from the National Energy Regulator of South Africa and Anita Matthews, Director of Africa Electricity 2012, talking about tariff pricing for developing economies.